It was a quiet evening in the house, one of those nights when the silence felt heavier than usual. My husband was away on business again, leaving me alone to look after the house and keep myself occupied. It was during these long nights that I often found myself reflecting on life, on choices made and paths taken. There was always an undercurrent of loneliness creeping in, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The house was dimly lit, and I was lost in my thoughts when I heard a faint noise coming from the bathroom. At first, I dismissed it as the creaking and groaning of an old house settling into the night, but the sound persisted, subtle but clear. Curious, I got up to investigate. As I approached the bathroom door, I hesitated. It was partially ajar, the soft yellow light spilling into the hallway. For a moment, I debated whether to turn back. This was, after all, my stepson's space, his private moment. But something, perhaps concern, perhaps curiosity, compelled me to step closer. Through the small opening, I could see him standing by the sink, shirtless, water dripping down his arms. He seemed preoccupied, focused on washing himself, and completely unaware of my presence. My first reaction was one of shock. He was no longer the boy I'd met years ago. He had grown into a young man, tall and lean, with a quiet confidence that I hadn't quite noticed before. I felt a wave of embarrassment. I shouldn't be here, shouldn't be watching, but my feet remained rooted to the spot. My mind raced with thoughts. Was he all right? Was he hurt? Or was this just a normal part of his routine that I had stumbled upon? The maternal side of me wanted to intervene, to offer guidance, but another part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, felt something else entirely. Just as I was about to step back and retreat to my room, he looked up. His eyes met mine, wide with surprise and embarrassment. There was a moment of silence in which neither of us moved or spoke. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in that brief second. I didn't know anyone was home," he stammered, his voice breaking the silence. "I thought you might need help," I blurted out, my voice trembling and unconvincing even to my own ears. His cheeks flushed and he turned away slightly, clearly embarrassed by the situation. "No, I'm fine. I can handle it." But I didn't leave. Instead, I found myself stepping into the room, closing the distance between us. "It's okay," I said quietly, trying to sound reassuring. "I've been raising you since you were a boy. If there's anything you need help with, you can tell me." There was a vulnerability in his expression, a mixture of embarrassment and relief. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he murmured, barely audible, his head bowed. What had started as an innocent moment of concern was quickly turning into something else, something I wasn't prepared for. I stepped closer, my voice softer now, trying to ease his discomfort. "There's nothing to be embarrassed about," I said, though my own nerves were beginning to show. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed downwards as if trying to make himself invisible. The vulnerability in his posture tugged at something maternal in me, but it was complicated by an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "I just didn't know what to do," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It's different now." He gestured vaguely, as if words could not fully explain. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the mix of shame and confusion, and I knew this wasn't a moment to be shrugged off. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain an air of calm authority despite the strange situation. "It's normal," I replied, my tone soft but firm. "It's part of growing up, learning to take care of yourself." I reached for a towel and handed it to him to create some distance. "Here, let's start with this." He hesitated, but took it, his hands shaking slightly as he began to dry himself. He looked up at me, his expression uncertain. "You really don't think it's strange?" he asked, his voice a mixture of hope and doubt. I shook my head, trying to reassure him. "Not at all," I said, though my own thoughts were far from clear. "Everyone goes through changes. It's nothing to be ashamed of." I was talking to him, but I couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the air between us. It wasn't overt or intentional, But it was there, a faint ripple of tension that neither of us fully acknowledged. "You make it sound so easy," he said with a small nervous laugh, "but it doesn't feel that way." "That's because it's new," I replied, leaning against the sink to appear less imposing. "It takes time to figure things out, but you will. You're not a child anymore, and that comes with its own challenges." My words felt almost automatic, an attempt to steer the moment back to something safe and manageable. He nodded slowly, his grip on the towel tightening. I don't know if I'm doing things right," he admitted, his voice laced with vulnerability. "Sometimes it feels like I don't know what to do." The honesty in his words took me by surprise. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the moment, it was something deeper, a fear of inadequacy I hadn't seen in him before. Without thinking, I reached out and placed a light hand on his shoulder. "You're doing fine," I said softly. "You'll get through this and you'll be fine." His eyes met mine again, and for a moment the air seemed to still. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, gratitude perhaps, or something more complicated. I couldn't tell, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew was that it was a moment neither of us would forget. The hours that followed were filled with an uncomfortable silence. I tried to immerse myself in routine tasks, folding laundry, tidying the living room, but my mind refused to let go of what had happened. Every small sound in the house made me jump, my senses heightened as if someone might discover the moment I was now replaying in my head. My stepson was also unusually quiet. Usually he'd spend the evening in the kitchen or watching television, but tonight he stayed in his room. I could hear faint movements behind his door, but he didn't come out. I wondered what he was thinking, if he was as haunted by the memory of our interaction as I was. Guilt began to gnaw at me, slowly and relentlessly. What had I done? I told myself it was innocent, a moment of concern for someone I had helped raise, but the justifications rang hollow. The lines between caring and something else had blurred, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. The weight of it was heavy in my chest, a pain that wouldn't go away. I found myself pacing the kitchen, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. What if he told someone? What if my husband realized something was wrong? The thought of his suspicion, his anger made my stomach churn. But more than the fear of discovery, there was a deeper shame that I couldn't shake. I had crossed a line, not just in action but in thought, and I couldn't undo it. When I finally heard his door open, my heart quickened. His steps were hesitant, almost reluctant, as he entered the kitchen. He avoided my gaze at first, reaching for a glass of water. The tension between us was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken. I'm sorry about earlier," he said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. He set the glass down and looked at me, his expression uncertain. I shook my head quickly, forcing a smile that I hoped looked natural. "You don't have to apologize," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It wasn't a big deal." But the words felt forced, almost dismissive, and I could see he didn't believe them. I didn't want to make things weird," he continued, his brow furrowed. "I didn't know how to handle it, and then you—" He trailed off, his cheeks flushing red. I swallowed hard, my throat was dry. "It's okay," I said again, softer this time. "We don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." I wanted desperately to put this behind us, to erase the awkwardness that hung like a fog between us. But he shook his head. "I think we should," he said, surprising me, "because it feels like I screwed up." His words hit me harder than I thought they would. I wanted to tell him he hadn't done anything wrong, but the truth was more complicated. We were both responsible for what had happened, and I couldn't completely absolve either of us. Instead, I reached for the glass he had set down, my fingers trembling slightly. "You didn't screw up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just one of those moments. Things happen and we move on." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or understanding. I wasn't sure I could give him either. What I did know was that this moment, like the one before it, would leave a mark. The days that followed were marked by a strange silence, each of us navigating the unspoken tension in our own way. I threw myself into the mundane, busy with housework and errands, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that moment. But avoidance wasn't enough to quell the lingering unease. Every glance in his direction felt charged, every interaction carefully measured. My husband returned home that weekend, oblivious to the shift in the household dynamic. He was his usual self, chatty, affectionate, and completely unaware of the growing distance between his wife and son. As I watched him settle back into his routine, I felt the weight of my guilt deepen. How could I sit across from him at dinner, making small talk and pretending all was well? It didn't help that my stepson was quieter than usual. He avoided direct conversation with either of us, keeping his answers short and to the point. The lively relationship he once shared with his father seemed to have been subdued, replaced by a strained politeness that didn't go unnoticed. "Is he all right?" my husband asked one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. His voice was casual, but I could hear the concern in it. I froze for a moment, my hands hovering over the sink. "He's probably just stressed," I said, forcing a lightness into my tone. "You know how teenagers can be." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my explanation, but I could feel his eyes lingering on me. I avoided his gaze and concentrated on scrubbing a plate that was already clean. That night I lay awake in bed, the darkness pressing in around me. My husband's even breathing beside me only added to the noise in my head. I couldn't go on living like this, caught between the guilt of what had happened and the fear of it coming to light. Something had to give. The next day I found my stepson in the garden, sitting on the edge of the porch with his head down. He looked up as I approached, his expression cautious but resigned. I sat down beside him, leaving enough space to avoid making him uncomfortable. "We need to talk," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, it was in a low voice. "I've thought about it a lot," he said. "I don't know how to behave around you anymore. It's like everything's different now." His honesty disarmed me. "I know," I admitted, "and I hate that it's made things difficult for you, for both of us, but we can't let that define how we see each other." He looked at me then, his expression conflicted. "Do you really think we can just forget about it?" I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "Maybe not forget, but we can move on. We're a family, and that has to count for something. It doesn't erase what happened, but it doesn't have to ruin us." We sat in silence for a long moment. Then he nodded, his posture loosening slightly. "I want things to go back to normal," he said, his voice tinged with hope. "So do I," I replied, meaning it. As I walked back into the house, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least we'd taken the first step. And that was enough for now.